most Hollywood villains have a cartoonish feel to them. There's a real sense of black and white when you look at these villains. There's a real sense that the villain is almost a different type of human being, not a normal human being. He takes glee in the suffering of others. He fiendishly rubs his hands together, hoping to do more evil. And this is the way that Hollywood constructs most of its villains. And that's really the way that in our minds, when we tell ourselves the stories of good and evil, we tell ourselves the narratives of history, we generally take the villain and turn him into something that's almost not human. Very often the treatment that we give to Pharaoh is very similar. Pharaoh is the absolute villain. He is the murderer of Jewish babies. In one account, he bathes in the blood of Jewish babies. He is a hater of humanity. He is an enslaver of men. And we see Pharaoh as the absolute villain. We look at him as a cartoonishly freakish villain. And in fact, one of the very fascinating aspects of Pharaoh is that no less than 5 times, when he should know better, the Torah, the Bible tells us that he hardens his heart. He sees that God is intervening, and yet he hardens his heart anyway. And for most of us, we would say, does this have any relationship to our lives? And the answer generally would be no. Pharaoh is a villain. A villain hardens his heart. How do you harden your heart anyway? We would never imagine that we ourselves can harden our heart. But the truth is that we do. We very capably harden our heart. And I always wondered, what exactly does it mean to harden your heart? And I really got a perspective into this in an article that I read in the New York Times Magazine last week. The article was about a woman by the name of Judith Clark, who was involved actually in a robbery near my hometown of Muncie at the Nanuet Mall in October 1981. And that robbery went wrong, and she was the person behind the wheel. And 2 policemen were murdered during this particular robbery. The robbery wasn't just an ordinary robbery of people looking for money. It was a robbery of former 60s and 70s radicals. These were people who were committed to overturning the country. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a revolutionary act. And Judith Clark, among all of those who were the conspirators in this particular crime, Judith Clark was initially the toughest and the bitterest and the most stubborn. She was the one who actually didn't even do any killing. She was driving the car. But when it came time for the court date, she refused to have representation. She refused to behave in the courtroom, and so they couldn't keep her in the courtroom. She was sentenced to a minimum of 75 years in prison, and in prison she refused to speak to the guards. She was placed into solitary. She was incredibly uncooperative. At least she was uncooperative until 1986. At one point in the summer of 1986, she met a sociologist. And the sociologist made 2 remarks to her that got to her. And one remark is that she said to her, "I understand how you did this to yourself," this woman, Gilda Zwerman, said, "but I don't understand how you did this to your daughter." And at that point, Judith Clark started to cry. And Gilda Zwerman said to her after that, "You can't cry for yourself and Harriet and not see that the children of the men who were killed cried the same way for their fathers." Judith Clark, in describing that experience, said that her armor came down. And when I saw the word armor, I reflected on what the Torah says about Pharaoh hardening his heart. What does it mean to harden your heart? It means to put up armor and to refuse to allow the truth to come in. To put up armor and to refuse emotional feelings from touching your heart. You say to yourself, you know what? I have decided that I'm right. I'm not going to allow any arguments to sway my opinion. I'm not going to allow any feelings to sway my opinion. I'm going to put up armor. I'm going to fortify myself and not allow myself to think otherwise. What's interesting is that later on, after she moved on and she essentially changed her life completely. She spoke about the fact that for her, radicalism was very similar to what for others drugs do. She was addicted to being right. She was addicted to her opinions. And when you're addicted to your opinion, you refuse to allow anything else to come in. She had to be absolutely right. She could not have any doubts. And because she couldn't have any doubts, she put up armor and she hardened her heart. That's what it means to harden your heart. Now, we generally look at Pharaoh as the one who is the villain who can harden his heart. But examples abound of people hardening their hearts. If you look at politics anywhere, really anywhere in the world, but if you look at the way the political debate is conducted in the United States and in Canada, if you look at the way that discussions about ideology are conducted, it's always, I'm absolutely right. The people on my side are absolutely right. The people on your side are absolutely wrong. And for the same offense, if you're a Republican and a Democrat does that offense, they're terrible. If a fellow Republican does that offense, oh, well, it's understandable. We are addicted to being right rather than thinking carefully. We constantly harden our hearts. We put up armor and refuse to allow ourselves to think openly. Now, it's one thing if that type of heart hardening is done in the political arena. But unfortunately, very often we do that regarding our friendships and relationships as well. We close our minds, we close our hearts, we put up armor, and much like Pharaoh, we harden our hearts from the truth and we harden our hearts from love. We really need to learn how to be a little bit less like Pharaoh. He's not that different than we are.